That's working. All right. So welcome to week 5 of creating the M in MEL. So this is the first of the 2 weeks where we'll discuss how to build a measurement framework. So we're done with theory of change now and we're jumping into the measurement side of things. So in today's session, similar to last week, Leanne's going to do a recap of this week's content, but then we'll have an opportunity to dive into breakout groups to have a conversation with one another about some of the measurement elements that you might still be grappling with. Just as normal housekeeping, just keep yourself on mute except when you're speaking, and please feel free to use the chat box and the raise hand function if you'd like to communicate something to the broader group or to Leanne and myself. And as I mentioned, we are recording the session today for those who can't make it. And that'll be available later on this week on the learning management system. So I will hand over to Leanne now to go through this week's content.
Thanks, Keisha, and welcome back, everybody. Really good to see you again. Just checking with a nod of the head or a thumbs up. Can everyone see my slide set? Yep, thanks, Keisha. Okay, so as Keisha mentioned, we're getting into the M in MEL. So developing a MEL plan, you can see we've got these 5 components there. 1, clarifying your theory of change. We've already talked about that the last couple of weeks. Now we're moving into developing a measurement framework. And the other parts of a MEL framework come later: the scoping, the evaluation framework, and of course the all-important learning and reporting strategy. So today and next week, we're really focusing on number 2, developing a measurement framework. What are the steps for building a meaningful measurement framework? And we've chosen this word meaningful very deliberately because there's all kinds of measurement frameworks you could build. Which ones are truly useful and meaningful to you? And that's what we're all about here. So 1 is to clarify your users, the users of the monitoring and evaluation information, and what their information needs are. So being really clear on that to make sure you're capturing the right things. Identify measurement priorities from your theory of change. So if you've got a clear understanding in your theory of change model about how you think change is going to be brought about by your project, that's a very good basis for choosing some measurement priorities. The third thing is to then craft your measures, work out what your measures will be, not just what's a priority for measurement, but what the actual measure is. The difference between 2 and 3, identifying your measurement priorities and crafting your measures, is that your priorities are going to be driven by what outcomes or outputs or even activities are going to be important for you to measure, because you can't measure everything, and that will be guided a little bit by what's important to you as a project team, but also obviously what's important to the other users of the M&E information. Crafting your measures is taking those priorities and working out what would be a good measure of that activity, of that outcome. Then you need to choose your data collection method. So how are you going to actually collect the data against that measure? And if it's appropriate, set targets. Not every measure needs a target. And it can be a bit of a trap to try and set a target for everything. We use targets, the setting of targets, very strategically and selectively. So we're going to go through these most of these steps today. So we remember that the first step in your MEL framework, I'm just going to jump back here, is clarify your theory of change. Your measurement framework is attached to your theory of change. So in this table here, this level on the left-hand side, sorry, this column on the left-hand side is basically stepping out the outcomes and activities from your theory of change model. So listing them out down the left-hand side, and then deciding against those levels which are the priorities for measurement, recognizing that not every single activity needs to be measured, not every single outcome needs to be measured, and then choosing your measures. So this highlighted yellow column is what we're talking about now. How do we work out what our measures are against our theory of change? Throughout the rest of the recap, I'll be talking about method and baseline and targets as well. What makes a good set of measures? And we're thinking of them as a set of measures. They have to work together as a set. We want to look at those measures not just individually, but as a set. Are they balanced? And by that we mean that you've got some measures at every level of your theory of change, or at different levels. If not every level, at least different levels. That means you don't only have activity measures, you don't only have output measures, that you think about a good mix of some activity measures, some outcome measures, both short-term and long-term, things that you want to know and be able to see change in right now versus things that might take a longer time to see change in. Outputs and outcomes, a mix of simple measures and more complex measures. So you don't want everything to be super complex. The same, you don't want everything to be super simple. Not too many. I think this is the key. Less is more. A few really good and important measures is better than a whole bunch of measures that aren't that important. It's not about the number of measures, it's about their usefulness. And so ultimately, this set of measures should be able to tell a story of what you did and what progress is being made or has been made. That's our definition of what a good set of measures is. So what do we actually mean by measures? They're a way of determining what is changing. In our personal lives, we use the example from our personal lives, something we can all relate to. We're measuring things all the time, whether we think of it as a measure or not. Our height, our weight, our bank balance, these are some examples. How much petrol we have in our tank, maybe our well-being levels. There's a whole bunch of things that we could be measuring. Measures are usually expressed as a number, but they can be underpinned by scales, qualitative stories, as well as theoretical frameworks. So, for example, measures that I'm working with at the moment that are underpinned by academic or theoretical framework is the recently released, not reduced, I'm thinking of reduced because it's a disaster risk reduction framework that I've been working on. A set of measures that the University of New England has put out for disaster resilience across Australia. So whichever part of Australia you're in, you can click on the map and look at the measures for disaster resilience. So that's an example of a theoretical framework that underpins some of the measures we're choosing for our disaster risk reduction framework. And to note that measures are not targets. You can have a measure without a target or a measure with a target. They're not the same thing. Okay, so height might be a measure and the target might be a certain number of kilograms. There's different types of measures. A simple count, I noticed through some of the comments that came through on Yammer that people, one person in particular said that they realised that they've been using all of these, but they hadn't given them names. And it's good to understand that the difference between the different types of measures. A simple count, proportions. So instead of a simple count being the numbers of students who are in a class, a proportion might be the percentage of students across a given year in high school who are attending this kind of class. A significant milestone, a score or a grade, or an improvement against a qualitative rubric. Instances of change using open vessel measures and drawing from pre-existing scholarly indicator sets. So the Australian Disaster Resilience Index is an example of a scholarly indicator set. Open vessel measures are probably something that people are least familiar with. And this is where it's useful when there's when you don't really know what sort of change you're going to produce, but you know you want to produce change in a certain area. So say you're working on a project that's hoping to have some influence over policy, but you're not quite sure how policy change might come about. So instead of being very prescriptive about what that might look like, you might just keep it open, instances of policy change, and then you can count those numbers, but you can also describe them, what those types of changes have been. So these are just some examples of different types of measures. And what's important, it's a little bit like what we said before in terms of developing a balanced set of meaningful measures. These are the sort of principles for it, that from our perspective, you want to base your measurement on your theory of change. You want to include stories as well as numbers. I have a saying in Clear Horizon, no stories without numbers, no numbers without stories. Aiming for relevance over precision. So instead of trying to find the perfect measure, finding a measure that's actually going to be helpful in terms of providing you with some action, information that you can action, something that's useful for you as a project manager. Being user-focused, so really thinking about the people who need to collect the data, for them to understand why it's being collected and for it to be really embedded in their needs. Adapting the measurement system as you learn, right? So it's not uncommon for us to help an organisation develop a monitoring and evaluation framework or a set of measures, and they start to collect that data. And after a while, they decide these ones are really good, they're working really well, we want to keep these. These ones aren't working very well at all. We either can't collect them, they're not easy to collect, they're time consuming, or they're just not giving us the information that's useful. Dropping those. So adapting your measurement framework is really important. Your measurement system is to drop some measures that aren't working, drop whatever's not working, add new ones in that would be more useful. Don't fall into the trap of thinking I've got my set of measures now and I have to collect them for the whole life of my project. And if I don't do that, then I'm going to, there's going to be some adverse outcome from that. No, it's supposed to be a tool for you to help you manage your project. It's not supposed to be something that you are burdened with or beholden to. And obviously regularly look at the data. No point collecting the data and not using it. Regularly looking at it to draw out insights about your project. So that's measures. Let's move to methods now. So what methods might we use to collect data against these measures? You're all familiar with different measurement methods through your own work. Here are some examples that are commonly used, but again, it's very context specific, and you want to choose the methods that are very appropriate for your context, not just take what's from a list. The typical ones are obviously tracking your activities or tracking participation rates, social media analytics obviously becoming more important as people engage more online, or awareness raising messages are distributed online. So obviously analytics around that is really important. Online surveys, semi-structured interviews, irrespective of how they're run, self-assessment against various scales. So people being able to self-report their improvements in awareness or knowledge as a result of participating in some kind of research study. Impact logs, so capturing examples of impact that you can then go and investigate further. Capturing stories of most significant change, capturing stories or instances of policy and systems change, and partner reporting. So if you are managing a project with several partners and the partners are reporting data back to you, that data is part of your own data collection. So their reporting becomes your source of data for your reporting to a funder, for example. These are just some of the common measurement methods, and most people are familiar with at least surveys and interviews. Right, and I guess one thing to say is that there is no recipe book for choosing your methods, that every method has bias, some sort of bias, which is why using a couple of methods is a good thing to sort of minimize the risk of bias. And also it does depend on, the skills of the people who are doing the measurement, the cost of those tools, whether you can do them, whether they're freely available, whether you have to spend time and money learning about them, getting licenses to them, that sort of thing. So a few considerations there. It comes down to really the time you've got available, the skill sets that are required, and any costs. And those things are the things you need to take into consideration. Okay, so why have we jumped to targets now before baseline? Because depending on what your target is and whether you have them, that will determine whether you need a baseline. So you really need to think about the target side of things before you decide whether you need a baseline. So let's talk about targets now, and then we'll jump into baselines. So basically, we have a theory of change model. We've got our outputs and our activities and outputs and outcomes written there. And that model gives us an understanding of how we think change will occur, but it doesn't tell us how much change is good enough, okay? So, and that again is context specific. You might have a very small project, a very small budget, and you expect a small amount of change. It might be that your project's been funded for many millions of dollars and you'd expect a reasonably large amount of change for that, if you're thinking from a value for money perspective. So targets help us put some expectations around how much change is good enough. And some people call them KPIs, key performance indicators. But it says different languages used for different things, but what's really important is to remember that a target is optional, okay? Sometimes a funder will set a target for you and you don't have much of a choice, but other times you want to set them for yourself because you want to be quite clear how much is good enough. And some projects, they just don't lend themselves to targets, okay? So again, context specific. Don't think that because there's a target column in your measurement framework template that you need to fill every box in. What makes a good target? It's something that encourages excellence. From our perspective, it encourages excellence. It encourages you to strive to achieve the thing that you're trying to achieve. It relates to what is valued. Okay, so in Canada, there's an example there that we were aware of from a project that some targets were developed for a program that was trying to work with the Great Lakes system. And instead of putting things it relied on community monitoring, community measurement, and instead of putting down technical types of measures like pH values and so forth, they included measures around swimmability and fishability, because that was what's important to the community, and then created some targets around that. So swimmability was a kind of way of describing in the way of a target that the lake was healthy, okay? The other thing that makes a good target is that it focuses on the destination and not the outputs. So we favour outcome targets rather than output targets. If you have an output target, even though it might be appropriate, what it does is it locks you into achieving the output. And we all know that there's often many ways to achieve an outcome, and our project is designed to achieve an outcome through a particular way, but it may become apparent as you're implementing your project that that's not the best way to achieve that outcome. If you set a target at the outcome level, it allows you flexibility in adapting your project activities to help you achieve that outcome. If you know that, for example, this type of activity is not really working to get us the outcome that we want, so we're going to start using this kind of activity. An outcome target means that you have that flexibility, but if you're locked into some activity or output targets, you might be a little bit hesitant to change your activities, even if you know they're not really working, especially if a funder is expecting some reporting on that. And I've seen an example of that with the Environmental Protection Agency in New South Wales and Australia, where they put out some grants, and the grantees were using Clear Horizon for some advice on their measurement framework. And through the process of going through the theory of change and thinking about their measures, they came to realise that the KPIs that they had in their contract with the funder, with the grant-making body, were not actually appropriate, because they realised they didn't want to do that activity to improve water quality. They actually wanted to do a different kind of activity, but they had an output target of installing a certain number of rubbish bins to prevent cigarette butts from being dropped in the street. And so but because they'd gone through this thinking process, they had a theory change model, they had started to think about their MEL, they were able to go back to the funder and say, actually, we know our contract has this output target, but in fact, what would be more appropriate is this kind of target. And it wasn't about less work or anything like that. It was about what was more appropriate in terms of trying to achieve the outcome. So that's why outcome targets are really useful instead of only output targets. And then the other thing that makes a good target is sometimes it's helpful if the targets are what we call SMART. So specific, measurable, appropriate, relevant, and time-bound. There's a lot of literature online if you wanted to look that up, and you've probably become aware of it in the past already through your work. But it's a nice little acronym that helps us remember what a good target looks like, that it needs to have these attributes. So that's our thinking about targets. Now we can think about baselines and whether we need them or not. So here's an example of two examples of measures or indicators that we might use in a project. And this is actually the two of the actual measures that are used in the Story Labs case study that was provided as part of the material for this training. The first example is that 60% of students are highly engaged in Story Labs classes. So we've got a measure of engagement and we've got a target of 60%. This is an example of a measure of the quality of what we're doing in the classroom, getting good engagement. The second example is also a measure with a target, the measure being increased critical thinking and creativity, and the target again being 60%. The first example doesn't require a baseline because Story Labs classes weren't running when previously. It's the first time they've been run. So we're just simply interested in the level of engagement, not the level of engagement compared to some previous time period. But we are expecting at the end of the program, and this was a measure that was set for the end of program outcome, we are expecting increased critical thinking and creativity at the end of the 3 years. So this one is an example where we do want to see a baseline in place. We want to understand what the level of capacity was in terms of critical thinking and creativity at the start of the program, and we want to be able to compare that at the end of the program. So any measure or target that has the word increased in it is a good clue that you might need a baseline, because you can't say something's increased unless you know what it was like at the beginning. But another thing to remember is that running a baseline study can be time consuming and expensive. So think very carefully whether you need to do a baseline at the beginning of something or whether you can retrospectively create a baseline. And by that I mean you could ask students about their extent to which their critical thinking has changed from when they started the program to now. You could create a survey with very carefully considered questions that allows you to retrospectively understand what it was like before and what it's like now. And I'm not saying that's what you must always do. I'm just saying that, you know, it can be expensive and time consuming to run a baseline. So think about how you might otherwise understand improvements or increases without necessarily having to do a study in year 0 and a study again in year 3. So if we go back to this example here, the measure of engagement, which would be down here as part of activities and reach, we wouldn't have a baseline for that. We would just say 60% of students are highly engaged. But up here at our influence outcomes, our sphere of influence outcomes, our intermediate outcomes, or end of program outcomes, where we do want to see this increase in critical thinking, we would have a baseline in there. Okay, the last part of measurement here is obviously when you set up your measurements, you need to think about your measurement framework as a system. Yeah, and a way to do that is to think about the user journey. So who's going to use the measurement data for what purposes, to drive what decisions? So right through from collecting it, designing it, collecting it, bringing it together, looking at it, making sense of it, drawing out the insights, adapting your measures and reporting. All of that is part of the system, and it's useful to think of that system from the user perspective. Then you can think about, okay, at each step along the way, who needs to be involved and what might be the problem areas or what we call the pain points. And then also planning out your annual cycle, if it's an annual cycle, sometimes it's quarterly, 6 monthly, sometimes it's longer, of measurement data collection, adaptation, and reporting, that short cycle and longer cycle of measurement. It's part of your system, and it needs some processes wrapped around it to make that work. Okay, that is the end of the, I'll stop sharing my screen now, the end of my recap on the content that hopefully you had time to go through during this past week. I'll hand back to Keisha now.
Thanks, Leanne. All right, so with the rest of the time that we've got left today, we're going to be spending it in breakout groups. Very similar to last week, I'm just going to drop the link into the chat. So everyone should have access now. And what we're going to do, you're actually going to be in your project groups. I think there's only 2 people that are not from project groups just because they're, the rest of their team isn't here today, so it would be a very lonely group otherwise. So in the project group, so group 1 will go to the group 1 slide, group 2 go to the group 2 slide, and it will be allocated when you go into the breakout room. But we're just wanting to know if you have any questions about measurement frameworks from Leanne's presentation today or this week's content online on the learning management system on the LMS. And any insights that you might have about specific measures for your own program context or previous experience. We would really love you to be able to share that with the rest of the group. And if you do have some experience in creating a measurement framework, feel free to come back to the group and unmute yourself, because we'd really love to hear from you. Are there any questions about the activity before we go into the breakout groups? No, I'm getting shakes of the head. I think that's a good sign. All right, so we'll be in the groups for about 15 minutes. I will let you know of a 5-minute and a 2-minute warning before we jump back out. So see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had some good conversations with your project groups. And it's good to know that you're probably all familiar with each other now. So we're just going to, I'm going to take a question from each group, and then if we've got time, I might pop in some more questions. So I'll send them, I'll ask the question to Leanne and Leanne will answer. So I'm actually going to start from group 6 and then work my way up. So one question from group 6 was, why do you use measurement in place of monitoring?
Yeah, great. Okay, first thing I would say is that you can use either, okay? So neither is right or wrong. We used to say monitoring all the time, and we've recently moved to measurement because a lot of programs have monitoring as part of like some of the broader environmental monitoring they might be doing. And it's more of a passive term, whereas measurement is more of an active term around actually measuring what's going on in your project rather than monitoring what might be going on in the environment. But neither term is right or wrong.
Thanks, Leanne. So from group 5, the question here was, is it wrong to use the exact number rather than the percentage when it comes to analysing data?
No, it depends on your project. So it depends on what you're collecting. Some things are appropriate for a number, and other times it's useful to have a percentage or a proportion. So sometimes you just want to know the absolute number of, so let's just say you're running an awareness raising campaign around some new seed variety in a province, and you want to know you know, how many people you've reached. Well, maybe you can say we reached 100 farmers. Okay, that is a measure. It gives you some information. But if it doesn't really tell you, it's about a relativity, right? So is 100 good, or is it a lot, or is it a little bit? So imagine a province with 1 million people. 100 maybe it's not so good. But maybe it's a province with 500 people, 100 is amazing. So a proportion is useful in that respect. It gives you more information than just a simple count. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Leanne. A question from group 4. Great question here. To what extent can measurement frameworks be developed under a participatory approach? Is it possible, and would you recommend it?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, it's very possible. Would I recommend it? Absolutely. Is it always possible? No. But why do we recommend it? Because if you engage the people who are going to be responsible for collecting the data in deciding what the measures should be, how they'll be collected, and how often they'll be collected, you're much more likely to get good buy-in to measurement. Often we're relying on other people to capture measurement data on our behalf. And so their involvement in that process is really important. When you make choices about what to measure, you're making choices about what's important to know. And it's really great for people who are in a project, especially if there's delivery partners involved and broader groups than just your small little project team. It's good to get everybody on the same page. Why are we collecting this? Why is it important? So that everyone understands why we're collecting this data, how it's going to be used, and they're more buy-in then to collecting it and to sitting down and making sense of it and using it, which is the whole point of measurement.
Thanks, Leanne. So group 3, one of the questions here, I'm just going to answer really quickly. Can you please elaborate about MSC, so most significant change? We'll talk about that when we come to the E in MEL, so we'll answer that there, as well as it's in this week's content too. But the question here is, what do you do when there is no baseline?
What do you do when there is no baseline? Well, first you need to know whether you need one, right? So if your program is trying to increase something, improve something, and you want to actually attach a target to it, it does help to know what that baseline is. We often are asked to do evaluations where there's no baseline data, but the program was trying to improve something, increase something, change something. So we've got to find a way of being able to understand whether there's been a change and how much change there's been in the absence of a baseline. I talked briefly before about retrospective baselines. So say your program is trying to improve farmer awareness of something. You don't need to do a baseline of farmer awareness of that thing right now and then do a study later on. Actually, I'm going to use the example of you guys. It's probably an easy one to relate to. I could survey you at the end of this course and test your awareness and whether it's improved or not of theory of change, of measurement, of evaluation, of learning, without having done a baseline. We didn't put you through a survey to test your level of understanding at the beginning and then find out at the end whether it's improved. We could simply ask you at the end whether your understanding has improved, and you could even ask if it's improved a little bit, somewhat, a lot, or not at all. So we can find out not just whether there's been change, but the quantity of change by asking you, the individual, your level of experience of change. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thanks, Leanne. A question from group 2. Are we supposed to measure broader goals as they beyond our sphere of influence?
It's a really good question. I don't think supposed to is there's no right or wrong there. We just say be very careful about putting time and money into measuring things that are beyond your sphere of influence. Be very careful about how you're going to use that data. Okay, so sometimes you do want to track something in the broader population. So for example, let's say there's a program to improve students' comfort with technology, okay, and it's a long-term program, and it's going to go for, I don't know, say 3 years. And at the same time, so maybe an NGO is doing that, and at the same time, iPads have become really cheap, data has become really cheap, access to the internet has improved, there's all these other things going on in the environment that would also affect the extent to which children are now more technologically literate, not just your program. So checking technology literacy rates amongst children, which is a population level thing, is an example of a broader goal. Your aim of the program is to improve, say, the literacy of children with technology. Tracking that is actually probably not going to tell you much about your program and its effect. It's just going to tell you a lot about how technologically literate rates are going across the population in general. So you might be interested to know that, and you can certainly track that if someone else is capturing it for you, but you'd want to be careful about putting too much effort into tracking it yourself. Again, you have to make that call program by program.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. And question from group 1 here. Where in the theory of change can we draw our measurement strategies from, and how do we know the type of measurement strategy to use? So similar to the last question, but a bit different.
Where in our theory of change to draw our measurement strategy from? Yep. So you look at your theory of change model, you want to make sure that it's going to be a while before you see change at the end of program level, at the high level. So the point of tracking change at the early stages is so that you know you're on track to achieving your longer term change. You can think of tracking your intermediate outcomes is like a lead indicator of a lag effect. It helps you, if you capture that in the early days, it means you can adjust your program to be more effective if you realize that you're not getting the kind of change that you want. So we would suggest always at least capture some data around your intermediate outcomes level. It gives you a good indication of whether you're on track, certainly your activity level as well. So that's how you use your theory of change to make some choices around measures, but you have to be very disciplined. You can't measure everything. So you need to make some very strategic choices about what you are going to measure. An example of that might be, say you're running a program, let's say it's got several streams of work, and one of the streams you've done many, many times before. You kind of know how it works. You're pretty comfortable with it. You're pretty sure that this part of your program is going to work. But the other parts of the program might be less well tested, less. You haven't maybe not implemented them as often, and you kind of want to check whether that bit's working. So maybe you put your measurement effort there and not the bit that we do all the time. We know how it works really well. Okay, I'll just see, there's a few questions coming through on the chat. Keisha, should I address those?
Yeah, that would be great. Just a couple. I think we've got only a couple of minutes left.
Okay. So Philip, actually my understanding on MEL has improved with a question mark. I'm not sure whether you're making a comment on whether it has or not, or whether you're telling me it has. Retrospective change measure may be sensible for short-term projects, then long-term programs. Yes and no. I mean, I understand where that's coming from. And yeah, definitely, especially if you're working with a small cohort of people, for example, it might be easy to go back to those people and ask them, okay, we trained you in this 3 months ago or last year or something like that, how is that for you? But sometimes we're trying to create change in people over 4 years, really change the way they behave, the way they think, their practices, agricultural practices and stuff like that. So as long as you're working with the same cohort of people, you can go back to them and ask them about the change that you've seen retrospectively. Where it becomes problematic is if we sample a population, create a baseline, and then we sample a population again, and we're just trying to see what the state is between those two timeframes, but the actual individuals may not be the same people. That's where it gets tricky. Thank you, Philip. Your understanding on MEL has improved. That's fantastic, and only you can make that comment, right? And just going to Annie's question, the meaning of the sphere of influence. So when we described the theory of change model at the beginning of the first few sessions, we talked about the sphere of control. That is, we do these activities and we create these outputs. So we train some people and they have this new awareness now of something, whatever we train them in. We have control over that. It's hard to turn up to training and not learn something, right? But then, usually the point of the training is to get people to start thinking differently about something. Well, you hope to influence their thinking. For example, we are influencing your thinking on the value of theory-based measurement frameworks, right? but you may leave the course maybe believing that or maybe not. We can't control it, but we're certainly trying to influence that. So a sphere of influence is beyond the sphere of control, and it's usually around if we're trying to change practices or behaviors or attitudes or mindsets. We can't control that, but we can certainly influence it. So we have sphere of control, type, activity-based, sphere of influence around the intermediate outcome level, end of program outcome level, and then even greater than that, our sphere of interest, which is the broader goal level. We're interested in these bigger things that we're trying to influence. Maybe we've got time for this last question before Keisha needs to wrap up. It's 3 minutes to go, and I know she has some administration to talk to you about. Another question, ex ante and ex post would be another type of measurement framework to measure adoption. I would say that I don't think it's a type of measurement framework, it's an approach. You can do evaluations before a program starts, understanding how likely the change is going to be, and you can do an evaluation after a project to see whether the change actually took place. So they're different types of evaluation rather than a different type of measurement framework. Okay, there's some other questions coming in, but I do need to stop. But like we did last week, we can follow up with some of these questions outside of this session. Thanks, Ani.
Thanks, Leanne, for that. So if some of your questions didn't get answered today, instead of us sending it to you in the email, if you can put it in the discussion board and we'll get back to you there. So if you have some burning questions that weren't answered, that would be really helpful for us. Thank you. So just a couple of little admin pieces. So I think, Suchi, at the beginning of the session, you asked if we provide an ebook of the complete training materials. So we can. It is only updated annually, so it might not accurately reflect what you're learning now, but we will only provide that at the end of the full module. So at the end of the LNML, which I think is in June, July, that's when we'll provide it. The rationale for that is that we just don't want you to jump ahead too much and start getting confused with the terminology. So for now, you still will have access to a lot of the theory of change, the MNML content. So feel free to flip back and forth on some of those concepts as we go along, but just know that you will be provided a PDF once the complete course is complete. Complete course is complete. And the second thing I just wanted to remind you is that the assignments, the theory of change assignments for your project groups are due today, close of business today, the 10th of March, wherever you are. So I think only 2 groups have submitted at the moment and 1 has asked for an extension, but please get in touch with your project groups to create the theory of change and submit it as an assignment. That way you'll be able to get really good feedback from us. So that way you can change or amend anything that you might need to change before then using that to develop your measurement framework, because that assignment will be due in a couple of weeks as well. So we just want to make sure that you get on top of the theory of change learning while we're going through the content for the measurement framework. But it is 5 o'clock. I will leave it there. We'll send the recording as well as the slide set on Friday. That will be in your weekly email. So yeah, if you wanted to watch the session again and go through any of that content, it'll be there as well. But for now, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.